All right, we are back with a new video, and today I'll be putting together my Dreamcast for Survivor South Africa Return of the Outcasts. Obviously, this season was announced back in November, and we heard that it's going to be a second chance style season. And while it is a bit disappointing that the first returnee season of Survivor South Africa will not have any winners or even people that made it to Final Tribal Council, I'm still pretty excited for this season, and I thought it'd be fun to just run through some people that I personally would like to see on the season. Now, before we start, I guess we should probably get into what my criteria will be for this Dreamcast. Now, it's a bit unclear at this time which seasons they'll be casting from. I mean, we saw on the promo poster that there are three emblems, sort of to signify potentially the three seasons that have been filmed by LaRue and the current production team. And if that's the case, then obviously that closes the door to a lot of the seasons that came out before Philippines, which again would be a bit disappointing. But for this video, I'll be mainly focusing on those three seasons for my cast. I will go through some honorable mentions of people from the pre Philippines seasons, of course, but then I'll dive straight into this cast, which will mainly focus on the most recent three seasons. So let's go through some of the honorable mentions. These are mainly people from the pre Philippines seasons who are probably less likely to be cast given that they are from before Philippines. But these are people that, if they are going to be casting anyone from these earlier seasons of the show, that I would personally like to see. So, first up, I have Gareth from the original season, Survivor SA Panama. He was a very dominant figure on that season, really mastered his positioning well. And I feel like if the season had played out naturally, there's a good chance that it gets to the end and wins. But he's ultimately screwed over by Vanessa and Imzi coming back into the game at the final five. And even then, I mean, even after they came back into the game, I mean, he wasn't guaranteed to be voted out. But Vanessa and Imzi are able to outplay him, resulting in him being voted out there. So with that, I feel like he would have a decent arc for a return. However, I feel like it is unlikely he'll come back. I also considered Imzi from that season as well. Again, very likable figure, definitely one of the more notable characters from that season. And it was fun seeing him coming back into the game at the final five. Obviously, he gets to the final four and had a decent shot of getting to the end. I mean, if the game had played out naturally with a vote, then there's a good chance that Vanessa takes him to the end. But given that it was decided by a challenge, and obviously he loses the final three challenge, obviously he gets taken out through that. I would still really like to see him moving forward. Jumping forward to the next season, Malaysia, the only person I really considered was Manla. I mean, he was a very likable figure from that season. One of the main figures from that season that I really enjoyed. Obviously, he loses the challenge at the final four and is automatically eliminated because of that. But I would like to see him get a second chance. Unfortunately, though, I feel like it's probably unlikely. Jumping next to Santa Carolina, I didn't consider too many people from the season. The only person I really considered was Proverb. Again, probably not the best player in the world. I mean, she was kind of taken to the final three, and I don't think she wins if she gets to the end. I mean, the bigger lock was probably Ashley Hayden, but considering she got to final tribal, she's not eligible for this cast, so that's a big shame there. Jumping forward to Maldives, the main person I consider for that was Tejan. I mean, Tejan was a very big player for his time. Definitely one of the more strategic players from that season, really battling back and forth with Heike during a lot of that game. He flipped back and forth during much of that pre-merge. One of the more dynamic players in Survivor South Africa, especially for this earlier era. And I feel like if they are going to be casting people from the earlier seasons, he's probably one of the more likely people. But I'm not counting on it, but it'd be cool to see him back. And then finally, there's Survivor South Africa champions. And obviously, there's a number of possible returnees. And if they are going to cast anyone from before Philippines, this is probably going to be the season they draw from. But the main people I chose from there are Solly, definitely a fun, likable character there. Shane, who was a pretty big player on that season. He got voted out with two idols in his pocket. So I feel like he has quite the setup for a redemption there. And the other person I consider was Xavion, who obviously was a massive character on that season, got all the way to the final four, and I feel like he is one of these more dynamic players who would do relatively well on any given season. With those honorable mentions out of the way, let's get to the actual cast. Now, the way I decided to break this down is obviously we have three seasons to be going over. We have Survivor Philippines, we have Survivor Island of Secrets, and we have Survivor Immunity Island. And the way I decided to break it down is to have three starting tribes of six, and each tribe represents people from a given season. Now, personally, I wouldn't like it if that's how the tribe breakdown went. However, it's more so for the purpose of ensuring there's equal representation across each of these seasons. So there I have six returnees from each of these seasons, three men and three women. So I hope that makes some sense. So starting off with Survivor SA Philippines, the first person I have on my cast is Tevin. Now, obviously Tevin is a pre-merge boot. Obviously, there aren't going to be too many pre-merge boots on this list, but I do want to include a couple of them. But I think Tevin is one of those players that has quite a bit of a potential on the return. He is a super fan. He is one of the more strategic players to come out of the pre-merge. And while he is similar to one or two other people we'll be talking about later on in this casting list, I figured I wanted to include him on here. The next person I decided to include is Palessa. Obviously, Palessa was a fan favorite from this season, and she's pretty notable for having an idol play in the post merge. Obviously, she gets taken out, but I would really like to see Palessa return at some point, and I think she's pretty likely to return. Next up, I have PK. Obviously, PK was aligned with Tevin for a lot of the pre merge before he was convinced to flip against him at that tribal where Tevin went home. Obviously, in the post merge, he was a bit of an underdog and went out, but I wouldn't mind seeing him again as well. Next up, I have Katinka, who was a pretty big character on her season. I feel like of the women of this cast, she may not be my personal favorite, but I think if we are going to be casting three women from the season, especially if we're not including John, who got the final tribal, then I feel like Katinka is one of the more notable figures to talk about. Next up is Werner, who obviously is the biggest character of the season and probably one of the bigger locks to come out of the season. I mean, this is the guy who on day one found an idol clue and ate it. And yet, this is the guy who strategically dominated the game. I mean, I love Werner. He's a great character. I would love to see him come back. And the final person I included from this tribe is Annalise, who got to the final three. And again, I feel like Annalise is one of the better players to come out this season. And I feel like of the women, I would be more excited to see her come back from Philippines. Now we're moving on to Island of Secrets. And while this is probably the worst season of the three, I mean, it's still a pretty good season and has a pretty strong cast to go with it. So the first person I have on the tribe for that is Ting Ting, obviously a pre merge boot. And I really liked her on the season. She was a pretty fun character early on. I feel like she gets taken out way too early as a result of Jock's idol play, but also just a pretty explosive tribal on the whole. I would really like to see her again, although it's a bit questionable considering she is a third boot, but I would really like it nonetheless. The next person I have is another pre merge boot, and that is Rocco. Now, again, Rocco has a pretty strong start to the season. I mean, obviously, he finds an idol clue and he builds an all guys alliance, but was ultimately flipped on. And from then on, like, he was kind of an underdog to an extent. I mean, he didn't go to a lot of tribals on his season, but he was still a somewhat notable figure on the season. I would like to see him back quite a bit. The next person we have is Sipe. Obviously, was a massive character on the season and a pretty good player as well. I mean, she starts off on the bottom, but was able to integrate herself nicely. Was able to better her position throughout a lot of the game. Obviously, she gets taken out because she was targeting Rob, which resulted in her blindside. But I feel like she would do relatively well on the return. I feel like she has a lot of potential moving forward, and I would really like to see it. The next person on the list is Jock. I mean, obviously, Jock was one of the bigger players and one of the bigger characters of the season. Now, he probably didn't play that well at the end of the day. I mean, he did waste an idol early on and was sort of viewed as an underdog by the end of it, but I feel like he is one of the bigger characters and probably one of the more likely returnees from this cast. The next person we'll be talking about is Mike, who obviously gets to the final six and is a pretty notable player on the season. Now, he is outplayed by Rob at the end of the day, but I feel like he has a lot of potential. And I feel like with that, he could do reasonably well if he were to come back. So I would really like to see Mike. And the final person I have from Island to Secrets is Steffi, who obviously got to the final five. Obviously, she's not that great of a player at the end of the day, but she at least tried to turn on Rob towards the end, which obviously resulted in her getting voted out. But I feel like she is another somewhat notable figure from this season. And I feel like, based on the criteria that I have laid forth, she would be an interesting returnee nonetheless. And finally, we have the most recent season of Survivor South Africa, and that is Immunity Island. Now, Immunity Island is a season with a lot of great players and a lot of great characters as well, which kind of makes things hard, but I have to limit it to six. So, the first person I have on board is Carla. Obviously, Carla is a pretty notable pre merge figure. She was someone who was aligned with Mike during a lot of the pre-merge, but got a pretty bad swap. And from there, she tried her hardest to rebound, but obviously she didn't really have much she could do. And I feel like on her return, she would have a lot more potential. So I put her on. The next person I put on is another pre-merger, and I could see this person being left out because of their archetype, but I don't care. I want Dino back. Obviously, Dino was my winner pick coming into Immunity Island, and that was a bit of an embarrassment there. But I would like to see him come back. I mean, he didn't play particularly well, but I feel like he's someone who could learn from his mistakes and learn to play better socially to build better bonds. I would like to see him come back as well. The next person I would like to see back is Amy. Now, for me, it was a debate between Amy and Rainier. Obviously, those two were closely aligned during a lot of that game, but I decided with on Amy as I feel like one, she again doesn't have as much competition archetype wise, but also I feel like she might have more potential on a return. I feel like she demonstrated herself as a pretty capable player during a lot of that season, and obviously with that, I'd like to see her back. The next person I have on board is Anesu, and obviously Anesu was widely viewed as the favorite for a lot of that season ethically, and I feel like she demonstrated herself as a pretty capable player. I mean, she was very well positioned during a lot of that season. Obviously, she was one of the main people willing to flip on the Vuna tribe coming into the final eight, but obviously she was outplayed there. But I would still really like to see her back nonetheless, and I feel like she would do well on a return. The next person that I wanted to bring back is Kieran. Kieran is another pretty big player from that season. I mean, while he is kind of overshadowed by Tyson to a certain extent, I feel like he is a very strong social and strategic player. And I feel like if he were to come back, he'd do reasonably well there. And the last person I have on my cast is probably one of the bigger locks on the board, and that is Chappies. Obviously, Chappies was a major character on the season. You know, he was someone who got in trouble later on for stealing food, but with that, he became an underdog. He won a bunch of challenges, and he's just a very funny character as well. I mean, and I feel like he wouldn't do that poorly on a return, assuming his threat level isn't too high. But I like Chappies, and I would really like to see him come back as well. So there we go. That will do it for this video. I mean, if you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. I definitely plan to cover Survivor SA Return of the Outcast as we get more information about it. I mean, once we get the actual cast, I plan to do a preseason power ranking for that season. And then once the season actually starts, I plan to do weekly power rankings, like assessing each player by how they're doing on the game and how likely it is that they'll win. Obviously, stay tuned for that. I mean, there's also obviously content for other shows that are airing right now, like Amazing Race and soon Survivor 42. So, a lot of stuff to look forward to there. But for now, that is the video. See ya.